If you're newer to Dead by Daylight, there's a decent chance that you feel that grouping up with your team is a good choice when you're playing Survivor. In fact, this is something that is supported by the game itself, with multiple perks that only activate if you're around another survivor, and even offerings that allow you to spawn in with your teammates, such as the Shroud of Binding. However, offerings like this were added very early on into the game's development cycle, when Dead by Daylight had a very different idea of the sort of game it was going to be, when it was more oriented to being a horror and scary experience, when in reality, as Survivor, it is almost always better to stay split up than to actually group up together and do generators together or anything like that, and I'm going to talk about in this video why that is the case. Probably the biggest reason as to why you'd want to stay split up as Survivor is it denies the killer a lot of pressure and snowball potential. As killer, your main goal is to keep survivors off of the objective, generators, chase them, down them, and then hook them and eventually sacrifice them. However, as killer, typically at most you can only keep one survivor off of an objective at a time, of course, until eventually you start hooking people, and then a survivor has to go for the save and all of that. There are other ways you can generate pressure to keep survivors off of an objective, but when you're chasing a survivor, typically you can only keep one off of a generator. However, if survivors are grouping up and sticking together, this allows the killer to actually pressure multiple survivors at one time, which can allow them to deny multiple survivors the ability to do a certain objective. If two survivors are on a generator, the killer comes over and starts chasing one of them. If that survivor utilizes resources that are around that generator, the other survivor can't necessarily get back on that objective to continue doing it, since the killer is in the area and they could come and interrupt them and maybe even get an easy down. Not only that, the killer can snowball a lot easier if survivors are grouped up. If you down a survivor and then there's another injured survivor nearby, there's a good chance the killer will slug that first survivor, which is leaving them in the dying state, and go after the injured survivor. Not only does this make it so another survivor has to come and pick up that downed survivor if they don't have a perk like Unbreakable to pick themselves up, but the killer might actually get another down, get a hook state, or maybe even get two hook states off of simply the fact that two survivors were grouped up together. Not only that, but generator times are not nearly as efficient as you might think they are when you're doing them with your teammates. A generator by yourself with no perks or toolboxes or anything to augment the generator's speed takes 90 seconds from 0 to completion. You would think that maybe two survivors on one objective would split this time in half. As, two survivors working on an objective, it would only take 45 seconds. However, when survivors are doing a generator together, they suffer a debuff to their repairing speed. This is, if you've ever noticed how when you start repairing a generator with another survivor, your progress bar is red, it is because you are getting a debuff to your own repair speed. And in fact, doing a generator with another survivor takes 52 seconds instead of what you might think would be 45 seconds. Not only that, with 3 survivors it takes 42 seconds, and with 4 survivors it takes 40 seconds. It's not nearly as fast as you might think it is. So in general, it's better for survivors to instead split up on different generators and do those generators separately so they can pressure a different objective, as it's usually not as efficient as you might think. While there are perks like Prove Thyself that can modify this effectiveness, it's important to know that if a survivor doesn't have one of these perks, you typically shouldn't group up on a generator. That being said, there are still a number of reasons that you might want to group up as survivors. For example, if there's a fairly important generator that you have to get done, it's not a bad idea to utilize that shorter gen speed to get that generator done faster. A big example of this is the Gallows generator on Dead Dog Saloon. Not only is a fairly unsafe generator that usually results in the killer getting a hit if he comes to get you off of it, but it is usually in close proximity to 2 other generators, giving the killer access to an extremely nasty 3-gen in the late game if you don't get done a generator in that area. It's never a bad idea, like I said, to group up on these generators early to get them out of the way so you don't have to deal with them later. Another reason you might want to group up is if you want to reset, which is the act of taking multiple survivors from the injured state to the healthy state. So getting 3 survivors together and going to a remote part of the map that the killer probably isn't going to check out, and healing each other is sometimes a decent idea if you're having trouble getting objectives done and feel you might need to regroup and reset yourself for the late game. Of course, saving a survivor from a hook state requires you to group up, and that's something you do have to do. And additionally, you sometimes want to group up if you want to protect a death hook survivor, someone who is on their dying hook. You might go and take a hit for them to buy them more time, or might even try to go down for them if you think that is the correct play. But in general, when you are starting a game as survivor, it is almost always a good idea to just run away from all of your teammates, go into a remote part of the map, and do a generator on the opposite side of the map. 3 survivors on 3 different generators on opposite sides of the map is something that is incredibly scary for the killer, and if they take too long in their first couple of chases, it can already be a GG fairly early on. There's not much the killer can do, especially if they're not running some of the more meta regression perks, such as Scourge Hook, Eruption, or any of that nonsense. Anyways, I hope this video helped you out. I hope it gave you some advice, and I hope you learned something new from it. If you did, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it does support me and encourages me to make new content. And until next time, I will see you later.